On a ridge at the inmost end of the fjord of Roskilde, the cathedral displays its distinctive profile. This has been the site of a church for more than 1,000 years. With its characteristic tall spires, Roskilde Cathedral is visible from large parts of central Zealand. Throughout many centuries, Danish kings have been laid to rest in Roskilde Cathedral. The choice of just Roskilde for the purpose is not accidental, for according to tradition, it was right here that Harald Bluetooth, the first Christian Danish king, was buried. The part played by the cathedral for centuries as a royal burial place is unique in the world. With its many extensions and its beautiful surroundings, Roskilde Cathedral is regarded as one of the most distinguished churches of Denmark. By the same token, in 1995, the cathedral was entered in the UNESCO list of inestimable cultural treasures of the world. Since the Middle Ages, 21 kings and 17 queens have been buried in Roskilde Cathedral. Over the centuries, the church interior has formed the setting of innumerable events. In 2006, a memorial ceremony is held, attended by Her Majesty the Queen and members of the royal family. The occasion is the reinterment of the Tsarina Dama, daughter of the late Christian IX, and married to the Russian Tsar. As a consequence of the Russian Revolution, the Tsarina Dama returned to Denmark. She died in 1928 and was buried in Roskilde Cathedral. Previously, the Tsarina had expressed the wish to be buried in Russia beside Tsar Alexander III, her husband for 28 years. Accordingly, after the memorial ceremony, her coffin is taken from Roskilde Cathedral to St. Petersburg. This event is merely one among many that go to show that Roskilde Cathedral has deep roots in history. In order to find the earliest traces of Roskilde Cathedral, we have to go back more than 1,000 years into the past. Probably the first church in the area was a wooden one, erected by Harald Bluetooth about 985. At some time during the 11th century, the wooden church is replaced by a stone church made of limestone. At the middle of the 12th century, the art of brickmaking was introduced into Denmark. Now the building of a Romanesque brick-built church with wide three-aisle transepts is begun. Absalon, the powerful Bishop of Zealand, is in charge of the project. About 1200, the construction is altered, inspired in particular by the building of the great Gothic cathedrals in France. In contrast to the Romanesque style with its heavy, massive walls, the emphasis is now on an appearance of slenderness and plenty of light. Between robust brick pillars, large stained glass windows are inserted. Now light was able to penetrate into the church as an earthly counterpart to the celestial Jerusalem. The church is completed about 1280. On the floor of the nave, there are no pews. The congregation attends Mass standing. In the Catholic period, the church resounds with perpetual adoration and intercessory prayer for the salvation of mankind. Off to the sides of the main aisle, a series of side altars are built. Here the altar priests celebrate requiems, especially for the benefit of those who have founded shrines or otherwise endowed the church. The first extension in the 13th century is the chapter house. Shortly afterwards, the Absalon arch is added, linking the church with the bishop's palace. At the beginning of the 15th century, there are 50 side altars, A little more than 100 years later, the number has increased to about 75. The Margrete spire dates from the first half of the 15th century. During the reign of Christian IV in the 17th century, the large west towers acquire their characteristic tall spires. The distinctive Magi chapel is built during the 15th century. The Frederick V chapel dates from the late 18th century and is designed in the Neoclassical style. The north side of the cathedral affords a view of the large Christian IV chapel in the Renaissance style from the 17th century. In 1924, the Glücksburg chapel is built. In 1985, Frederick IX's sepulchre is added outside the church. The oldest part of the cathedral is the choir. Particularly during the Catholic period, the choir was the core of the church, and from early morning to late at night, the choir rang with prayers and the chanting of masses. The choir contains the tomb of what is possibly the most distinguished interment, that of Queen Margrete I. It was she who had united the Nordic kingdoms in the Kalmar Union. Following her death in 1412, Queen Margrete was buried in the Abbey Church of Sorø, but a year later the tomb was transferred to Roskilde Cathedral. It was confidently envisaged that Roskilde would now become the burial place for the rulers of the Nordic Union. The Kalmar Union, however, did not last long. During the Swedish wars in the 1650s, the sarcophagus was damaged and the Queen's golden dress was removed and taken to Uppsala in Sweden. A reconstruction of Queen Margrethe I's state dress is exhibited in the Cathedral Museum. Shortly after Queen Margrethe I's interment in 1413, new choir stalls were installed. Here the many canons had their seats during Mass and prayers. A canon is a priest attached to the choir. Earlier on, the choir was separated from the rest of the church interior by walls or latticework. Under the seats of the choir stalls, there is a small extra seat, a so-called misericord. When, during the hour-long services, the canons had to remain standing, they could get a little support. Farthest to the east, there are 4 lecterns with the symbols of the evangelists, here that of the angel of St. Matthew. Above the choir stalls, there are carved reliefs with subjects from the Old and New Testaments. In the Middle Ages, a 5-meter-high wooden triumphal crucifix was suspended over the choir. In 1806, the cross was sold in an auction. When the buyer sawed it up for firewood, a small Byzantine gold cross dropped out. Inside the small cross, a splinter from Christ's cross is concealed. In the Middle Ages, the large windows of the cathedral were covered with stained glass paintings. The stained glass windows were later destroyed in a fire. In the piers behind the choir, some of the oldest graves of the cathedral are to be found. According to tradition, Harald Bluetooth, the first Danish Christian king, is supposed to have been buried here. At the beginning of the 15th century, the cathedral had 50 side altars. 100 years later, the number had risen to between 70 and 80. In the cathedral, there are still traces of the many altars, especially in the form of frescoes. The side altars were founded by wealthy individuals who hoped in this way to diminish or shorten the torment of purgatory and secure their souls from eternal perdition. The patron saint of Roskilde Cathedral was St. Lucius. On one occasion, the cathedral sent a deputation of canons to Rome to acquire a costly relic. The canons returned with the skull of St. Lucius. Lucius was pope in Rome between 254 to 255 AD. The skull was able to work miracles, and it was the most precious relic of the cathedral. Among other places, St. Lucius is to be seen in St. Birgitta's chapel, where he thrusts his cross-staff against the evil dragon. In the same chapel, we see the small devil, Tutivilus. He is sitting in the corner with his inkpot and pen. He makes a note of those who are late and those who peddle gossip. St. Birgitta's chapel contains furniture dating from Catholic times. Among other things, the spacious filing cabinet of the cathedral from the 15th century. Originally, the cabinet stood in the chapter house, which had been established for the use of the cathedral chapter. The chapter house is the oldest extension of the cathedral, and here the fortune of the church, as well as its treasures, were kept. The Absalon arch on the east side of the cathedral dates from the beginning of the 13th century. It is built of limestone and forms a passage connecting the church with the bishop's palace. The Magi chapel was built by the first king of the Oldenburg dynasty, Christian I, and Queen Dorothea. The frescoes date from the second half of the 15th century. They constitute one of the largest coherent room decorations of medieval Denmark. The royal couple founded 3 altars, each with a priest attached. Every day the priest was to celebrate Mass and in all perpetuity pray for the salvation of the royal family. So on the walls, saints capable of interceding are represented. On one of the vaults there are pictures of the death of Christ and Doomsday. The celestial sphere, with angels playing the lute, harp and horn. An earthly fool throws the heavenly glory into relief and plays the flute and beats a drum. Here a king in the fashionable costume of the time. On his feet he wears pointed shoes and wooden overshoes. In the chapel there are the magnificent sepulchres of Christian III and Frederick II. In line with Renaissance taste, these are shaped like classical temples, with ornamentation inspired by ancient Rome. Seated on the roof, there are little boys, so-called putti, with reversed torches, symbols of death. On a pillar, a series of red marks are visible. They indicate the height of some of the royal personages who have at one time or other visited the cathedral. The cathedral was not exclusively reserved for royalty. Under the church floor, hundreds of other graves are in evidence. The oldest Gothic tombstones are slightly trapeziform. They bear a simple inscription or decoration. Here an altar priest was buried in 1480. In the ambulatory there lies a glossy black stone. In former times people used to spit on the stone. Here it was said lay the Helhest, a ghostly 3-legged horse portending death and misfortune. The majority of the tombstones of the cathedral date from the 16th and 17th centuries. In this period, life-size reliefs of the deceased were often used. An epitaph could secure one's posthumous reputation. It is a memorial tablet hung near the grave with room for a further eulogy of the deceased. Well-to-do persons built crypts in which to deposit their coffins. In time, such crypts were established in several of the old saints' chapels and porches. Some are closed with grills, others completely walled up. Great noble families had their own crypts, here that of the Troller family. The clock of the cathedral, with its mechanical figures, goes back to the close of the 15th century. The clock face indicates all 24 hours of the day and night, so the hand has an image of the sun at one end and one of the moon at the other. St. George comes riding and kills the evil dragon. Then Kirsten Bellringer strikes the quarters on the small bell, and Pierre Definer strikes the hours on the big one. The figures are moved by a huge mechanical timepiece. The present mechanism is from 1741, but does not differ very much from its predecessor. The Margrete spire originated in the first half of the 15th century. Since then, it has been renewed several times. Its special function was to signal the hours of the canonical prayers in the choir. The big tocsin in the north tower is the biggest medieval bell still in Denmark. 3 bells, all from the 16th century, hang in the south tower. All these bells are still in use. Medieval Roskilde contained as many as 15 churches and 5 monasteries. The Reformation of 1536 entailed great upheavals for the cathedral and the town. The Reformation saw the imprisonment of the Danish bishops. The Danish church was severed from Rome, with the king becoming the head of the Danish church. In the old Catholic stronghold of Roskilde, there was definitely no enthusiasm for this process. The cathedral was made to hand over its great treasures and relics to the king. Most of the goods and the vast landed property of the church were also taken over by the crown. The Reformation also involved a radical transformation of divine service. Prayers at the canonical hours, processions, requiems, and the celebrations of saints' days all came to an end. The many side altars were demolished, and the number of priests at the cathedral fell from more than 100 to just a few. After the Reformation, the organization of the cathedral was adapted to the needs of the Protestant Church. The sermon now became a crucial part of the service. This required a pulpit for the preacher and pews for the congregation. The king acquired his own seat, here the imposing royal pew of Christian IV. In 1555, the cathedral obtained a new organ, constructed by the Dutch organ builder Herman Raphaelis. The Baroque organ case was added about 100 years later. The large organ of the cathedral is one of the finest historical organs of Denmark. The church also acquired a new altarpiece. It was created in Antwerp and dates from about 1560. The altarpiece is made of gilt oak. It is almost completely covered in gold leaf, which has been laid on a layer of chalk coating the wood. The open altarpiece depicts the events of Easter week. Christian IV's chapel is the first regular royal sepulchral chapel after the Reformation. The building is in Dutch Renaissance style. The windows in the gable facade are flanked by 4 little boys, putti, with symbols of death. Up on the ledges of the gable, Christian virtues are represented by 7 female figures. The sepulchral chapel was not arranged in its present shape till a couple of 100 years after the death of Christian IV. In the mid-19th century, strong national romantic currents swept the country. In the chapel, this finds its expression, among other things, in the large paintings on the wall. One represents the battle scene aboard the man-of-war Trinity in 1644. During the fighting against the Swedes, Christian IV was hit by a shell splinter and fell wounded. At first the crew thought he was dead, but shortly afterwards the king stood heroically on the deck. The other painting portrays the king as a just judge, shrewdly exposing a fraud. Both paintings are from the 1860s and were carried out by Wilhelm Marstrand. The statue of the imposing king was executed by Bertel Thorvaldsen in the 1840s. Christian IV's sarcophagus is in the middle of the room. The decorative iron grills were fashioned by Caspar Finke, the court blacksmith. They form part of the original decoration. The monograms of the king and the queen appear among the scrolls, surrounded by mythical creatures. The chancel was fitted up to become a royal burial place in the 1690s. In the chancel, Christian V and Frederick IV and their queens rest in magnificent marble sarcophagi with portraits of the deceased. Frederick V's chapel is one of the most outstanding examples of neoclassicism in Denmark. The architects, C.F. Harsdorff and later C.F. Hansen, had drawn inspiration from Paris and Rome. The classical element reappears in the sepulchres of the chapel. Thus, a Roman imperial column with a portrait, medallion and urn form part of Frederick's colossal monument. The absolute monarch was considered God's deputy on earth. On his death, he was deified like the Roman emperors. The 12 sepulchres reflect the history of style during well over 100 years. The marble sarcophagi were replaced by coffins covered with woven material. The inspiration for part of the ornamentation was derived from the Orient. Later, wooden coffins became popular. Here, the sepulchral monument of the popular Frederick VII from 1863. With the death of Frederick VII, the Oldenburg dynasty ended. The new royal dynasty acceded to the throne with Christian IX in 1863. The Glücksburg dynasty acquired its own sepulchral chapel at the north side of the church. The architecture of the building is inspired by both Romanesque and Byzantine styles. After a long reign, Christian IX died in 1906. The large sarcophagus of Christian IX and Queen Louise stands towards the north in the chapel. After only a short reign, Frederick VIII died in 1912. At the funeral of Christian X in 1947, there was a large attendance from Denmark and abroad. Here the procession arrives at Roskilde Cathedral. To the east of the chapel stand the plain stone coffins of Christian X and Queen Alexandrina. So the three first royal couples of the Glücksburg dynasty rest in the chapel. Frederick IX died in 1972. The many flags flanking the king's last progress through Roskilde include the banners of veteran societies, ex-servicemen's leagues, sports associations, the Red Cross and youth organizations. Queen Ingrid, Queen Margrete, Prince Henrik, Queen Anna-Marie, King Constantine, Princess Benedicta, Prince Richard, Prince Knud, the king's brother, in 1985, the new royal sepulchre beside the Glücksburg chapel came into use. In the open brick octagon, plants from the North Atlantic parts of the kingdom are grown. The tombstone is fashioned from Greenlandic granite. In November 2000, Queen Ingrid was buried beside Frederick IX. Several times during its 1,000-year history, the cathedral has been struck by fire. In August 1968, disaster is imminent. During restoration work, fire breaks out in the Margrete spire. Fire engines from most of Zealand or into Roskilde. During the fire, it is feared that parts of the roof and vaults are going to crash into the choir. So in great haste, parts of the irreplaceable furnishings are covered up or removed. A prolonged effort finally succeeds in getting the fierce fire under control. Yet the entire Margrete spire has been burnt, and the heat melted both bells of the spire. The oldest bell dated as far back as the 12th century. The Margrete spire is rebuilt, and the new bells of the spire are cast from the metal of the old ones. Roskilde Cathedral is not only the burial church of royalty, it also acts as an ordinary parish church. At night, the church offers the opportunity for calm reflection and peace. The cathedral has unique acoustic qualities and often forms the setting for large-scale musical events. Evensong is often held in the cathedral. This form of divine service is based on the medieval canonical prayer as enacted during Vespers, the service held at sunset. There is no denying that Roskilde Cathedral is deeply rooted in history.